They called him the Beast of Bannock. They said he ate the hearts of the men he killed, and that no jail cell could hold him. So they built an iron cage and left it in the center of town for the vultures. In 1883, looking a man like Gideon Holt in the eye was a death sentence. But on a freezing Tuesday in November, a woman named Hattie Corcoran didn't just look at him. She walked right up to the bars, with the whole town watching, and whispered 3 words that would change the history of the Montana Territory forever. Please marry me. She wasn't looking for love. She was looking for a weapon, and she had no idea that by unlocking that cage, she was unleashing a secret that would burn the town of Orofino to the ground. This is the story they tried to bury. The stagecoach didn't stop. It merely slowed down enough for the driver to kick the trunk off the roof and shout for the passenger to jump. Hattie Corcoran hit the mud hard. The cold clung to her skirts, heavy and wet, smelling of horse manure and raw sulfur. She stood up, wiping a smear of black mud from her cheek. This was Orofino. It wasn't a town. It was a wound in the side of the mountain, bleeding gold and silver for men who had long since lost their souls. Hattie clutched her reticule against her chest. Inside was a letter from a man named Arthur Pym. "My dearest Hattie," it had said, "come west. I have struck a vein. I have a house with glass windows. Be my wife, and you shall never scrub a floor again." She was 24, with hands roughened by years of laundry work in Chicago, and eyes the color of a bruised sky. She wasn't naive. She knew Arthur Pym was likely exaggerating, but she expected a man. She expected a handshake. Instead, she was greeted by silence. "You the mail order girl?" The voice sounded like gravel grinding under a boot. Hattie turned to see a man leaning against a hitching post. He wore a tin star that looked too shiny for the grime on his coat. This was Marshal Jebediah Crane. He was a man composed of sharp angles and a smile that didn't reach his dead, pale eyes. "I am Hattie Corcoran," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the trembling in her knees. "I am here to marry Mr. Arthur Pym. Is he delayed?" The marshal chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near her boot. "Delayed? You could say that. Pym's been delayed under 6 feet of dirt for 3 weeks now. Cave-in at the Lucky Strike." The world tilted. Hattie felt the blood drain from her face. "Dead?" "Dead as a doornail," Crane said, stepping closer. He smelled of stale whiskey and rot. "And that leaves you in a bit of a bind, don't it, darling? See, Pym owed the town money. A lot of money. And since he paid for your ticket, that makes you part of his estate." "I am not property," Hattie snapped, her Chicago grit surfacing. "In Orofino, you're whatever I say you are," Crane whispered, his hand drifting toward the revolver at his hip. "Pym signed a contract. His assets cover his debts. You're an asset. You'll work off his debt at the saloon. Upstairs." Hattie took a step back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked around the street. Men were watching. Gaunt, hungry-looking miners with soot-stained faces. There was no pity in their eyes, only calculation. "I have money for a return ticket," she lied. "Stagecoach don't run back for another month until the snow clears." Crane grinned. "You got nowhere to go, Hattie. Tonight, you stay at the hotel. Tomorrow, you start work." He turned to walk away, confident in his web. Hattie stood frozen, the cold wind biting through her thin coat. She looked down the main street, desperate for a church, a schoolhouse, anything that signaled civilization. Instead, she saw the cage. It sat in the middle of the thoroughfare, a box made of thick, rusted iron bars, no bigger than a horse stall. It was exposed to the wind, the rain, and the jeers of passing drunks. Inside, huddled under a ragged buffalo robe, sat a mountain of a man. His hair was a matted mane of black and gray, his beard reaching his chest. He was chained hand and foot to the floor of the cage. Even seated, he looked massive, his shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. "Who is that?" Hattie asked a passing boy, her voice a whisper. The boy stopped, eyes wide. "That's Gideon Holt, the butcher. Killed 5 men at the Blackwood Creek massacre. Marshall says he's going to hang him soon, as the circuit judge gets here in spring." Hattie looked at the man in the cage. He wasn't moving. He looked less like a man and more like a dormant volcano. And suddenly, Hattie remembered a law. A ridiculous, obscure piece of legislation she had read about in a penny dreadful back in Chicago. A desperate measure for desperate territories. She looked at the marshal retreating into the saloon. She looked at the brothel that awaited her. And then she looked at the monster in the cage. Hattie Corcoran didn't scream. She began to plan. That night, the wind howled through the cracks in the boarding house walls, but Hattie didn't sleep. She sat by the flickering kerosene lamp, reading the small, leather-bound law book she had stolen from the marshal's office when the clerk wasn't looking. She found it on page 42. The Territorial Rehabilitation Act of 1881. Any condemned man, prior to sentencing, may be claimed by a spouse for the purpose of bonded labor and rehabilitation, provided the spouse assumes full liability for the prisoner's conduct and debts. It was a loophole designed to provide labor for widows running farms, but it was rarely used because it required marrying a criminal. But Hattie was already condemned. She was condemned to a life of prostitution by a corrupt marshal. She needed a protector, a monster. At dawn, before the town fully woke, Hattie walked to the square. The frost was thick on the iron bars. Gideon Holt was awake. He was sitting cross-legged, staring at nothing. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and utterly terrifying. As she approached, he didn't flinch. He just tracked her movement like a wolf watching a deer. Hattie gripped the cold iron bars. "Mr. Holt?" He didn't answer. He breathed out a cloud of steam. "My name is Hattie Corcoran," she said, her voice shaking. "And I have a proposition for you." Gideon shifted. The chains rattled, a sound that echoed loud in the quiet morning. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble that vibrated in Hattie's chest. "I ain't got no money, girl, and I ain't got no prayers." "I don't want your money," Hattie said. She leaned closer, checking over her shoulder to ensure the marshal wasn't nearby. "I know you're going to hang." "Men die," Gideon grunted. "I'm ready." "Are you?" Hattie challenged. "They say you killed 5 men at Blackwood Creek. Did you?" Gideon's eyes narrowed. For a second, Hattie thought he might reach through the bars and snap her neck. "I killed men," he said slowly. "But not those men. Not the way they said." "I believe you," Hattie lied. She didn't know if she did, but she needed him to listen. "Marshall Crane plans to sell me into the brothel to pay a dead man's debt. I have no weapons. I have no allies. But I have a law book." She held up the stolen book. "If we marry, I can claim you. I can take you out of this cage as my bonded laborer. You trade the noose for a wedding ring." Gideon stared at her for a long time. A dark, humorless laugh escaped his lips. "You're a fool, little bird. You think Crane will let you walk away with his prize prisoner. He'll kill us both." "He follows the letter of the law," Hattie said. He's arrogant. He thinks he owns this town. He won't expect a woman to use the statutes against him. Once the papers are signed, if he touches you, he violates federal territory law. He wants to be governor one day. He can't have a federal investigation. Gideon stood up. He was colossal. He towered over her, pressing his face to the bars. He smelled of pine resin, old blood, and unwashed skin. Why? He asked. Why yoke yourself to a dead man? Because, Hattie whispered, her eyes burning with tears she refused to shed, I would rather be chained to a monster I chose than a monster who chose me. Gideon studied her face. He saw the terror there, but he also saw the steel. He looked at the gallows being constructed on the hill. He looked back at her. If I get out of this cage, Gideon said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper, I am going to kill the men who put me in here, all of them. You understand that? You aren't marrying a man, Hattie. You're marrying a war. I don't care, Hattie said. Just save me. Get the key, Gideon said. Get the preacher and bring a gun. The sun rose over Orofino like a bruise, purple and swollen behind the gray clouds. By noon, the mud on Main Street had thawed just enough to become a quagmire, sucking at the boots of the miners shuffling toward the saloon for their midday meal. But they didn't make it to the swinging doors. A crowd had gathered around the iron cage. Hattie stood in the mud, her boots ruined, her posture rigid. Beside her stood Reverend Josiah Reed, a man whose hands shook from the delirium tremens and who smelled of communion wine gone sour. He held a Bible in one hand and Hattie's stolen $5 gold piece in the other. You sure about this, miss? The Reverend stammered, looking through the bars at the mass of hair and muscle that was Gideon Holt. Read the words, Reverend, Hattie commanded. Her voice was loud, designed to carry. She needed witnesses. She needed every pair of eyes in this God-forsaken valley to see this. Gideon stood inside the cage. He had washed his face with the water from his tin cup. The grime was gone, revealing a face carved from granite, a broken nose, a scar running through his left eyebrow, and eyes that burned with a terrifying intensity. He held his hands out through the bars. Dearly beloved, the Reverend began, his voice cracking. Well, ain't this a picture? The crowd parted like water. Marshal Jebediah Crane strolled through, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt. He was flanked by 2 deputies, men with low foreheads and shotguns. Crane looked at the scene, the trembling preacher, the defiant woman, the silent beast, and he laughed. It was a wet, ugly sound. Hattie, Crane sighed, shaking his head. I thought we had an understanding. You're putting on a show. Now, step away from the animal before I have you arrested for public disturbance. I am exercising my right under the Territorial Rehabilitation Act of 1881, Hattie declared, holding the book up like a shield. Section 4, Paragraph 2. I am claiming this prisoner as my husband and bonded ward. As of this moment, his debt is my debt. His life is my responsibility. Crane's smile vanished. His eyes darted to the crowd. He saw the miners watching, men who hated him, men who paid him protection money, men who were waiting for a sign of weakness. If he shot a woman reading a law book in broad daylight, the tenuous grip he had on Orofino might slip. That man is a killer, Crane spat. He's sentenced to hang. Has he been sentenced? Hattie countered. I checked the ledger, Marshal. The circuit judge doesn't arrive until April. Technically, Gideon Holt is merely accused. and an accused man has the right to marry. Crane stepped closer, invading her space. He leaned down, whispering in her ear so only she and Gideon could hear. You think a piece of paper protects you? You take him out of that cage, and you won't last the night. I'll have my men burn you out. I'll make you wish you were in that brothel. Hattie didn't flinch, though her heart felt like it was going to explode. If we die tonight, Marshal, the whole town will know who did it, and the federal marshals in Helena might finally take an interest in your books. Crane's face went purple. He looked at Gideon. Gideon smiled, a slow, feral baring of teeth. Finish it, preacher, Gideon growled. The sound was so deep it seemed to come from the ground itself. The Reverend Reed scrambled through the verses. Do you, Hattie Corcoran, take this man? I do. And do you, Gideon Holt? I do. Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you man and wife. The Reverend closed the Bible with a snap. God have mercy on your souls. Hattie turned to the marshal. She held out her hand. The keys, Marshal. Or do you wish to be charged with unlawful imprisonment of a bonded laborer? The silence in the street was absolute. The wind whistled through the cage bars. Crane stared at Hattie with a hatred so pure it felt like heat. He slowly unhooked a heavy iron key ring from his belt. He tossed it into the mud at her feet. He's yours, Crane said, his voice flat. But remember, Mrs. Holt, if he steps 1 foot out of line, if he steals an apple, if he spits on the sidewalk, I shoot him, and then I come for you. Crane turned and marched back to his office, his deputies trailing behind. Hattie knelt in the mud. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the key. She fumbled with the heavy padlock on the cage door. It clicked. The screech of the rusty hinges was the loudest sound in the world. The door swung open. Gideon Holt stepped out. He was taller than she had imagined, at least 6'4", thick with muscle built from years of hard labor. He stretched his arms, the shackles still on his wrists. He looked up at the sky, breathing in the free air, then looked down at Hattie. The crowd stepped back, fear rippling through them. This was the beast of Bannock. Free. The leg irons, Gideon said softly. Hattie unlocked them. He kicked the heavy chains away. He rubbed his wrists, where the metal had rubbed the skin raw. Where to, wife? He asked. There was no mockery in the word, only a strange, heavy weight. Arthur Pym had a cabin, Hattie said, trying to keep her voice steady. At the edge of the Blackwood claim, we go there. Walking? We have no horses. Gideon nodded. He looked at the crowd, his eyes challenging anyone to stop them. No one moved. He reached out and took the heavy carpet bag from Hattie's hand. His fingers brushed hers. Rough, calloused, warm. Walk behind me, Gideon murmured as they started moving. If they shoot, they'll shoot me first. And so, the strangest wedding procession in the history of the West began. A mail-order bride in a mud-stained dress and a bearded giant who looked like death itself, walking out of Orofino as the snow began to fall. The hike to Arthur Pym's claim took 3 hours. The snow began to fall harder, blanketing the treacherous mountain path in white. By the time they reached the cabin, Hattie's lips were blue, and she couldn't feel her toes. The cabin was a ruin. It sat precariously on a ridge overlooking a deep ravine. The roof sagged, the windows were covered with oilskin, and the door hung on one hinge. Gideon kicked the door open. He dropped the bag and immediately went to the hearth. It was cold, filled with the ash of a fire that had died weeks ago. Search for dry wood, Gideon ordered. He didn't ask. He commanded. Hattie bristled. I am not your servant, Mr. Holt. I am your benefactor. Gideon turned slowly. In the dim light of the cabin, he looked enormous, filling the small space. You are a woman freezing to death in a shack with no door. Get the wood, Hattie. We can discuss the hierarchy when we aren't at risk of frostbite. Hattie glared at him, but she saw the logic. She found a stack of dry cedar logs under a tarp in the corner. Within minutes, Gideon had a roaring fire going. The heat hit them, painful and sweet. Gideon barricaded the door, using a heavy table to block the broken entrance. Then he turned to face her. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Hattie realized, for the first time, that she was truly alone with him. The adrenaline of the town square had faded, leaving only cold fear. She had married a killer. She had released him. And now, there were no bars between them. Gideon sat on the floor by the fire, pulling a knife from his boot. Hattie gasped, backing against the wall. Gideon looked up, his eyes weary. I'm cutting the rot out of my boots, Hattie. Sit down. You're shaking the floorboards. Did you do it? Hattie blurted out. She couldn't help it. The Blackwood Creek Massacre. Did you kill those 5 men? Gideon stopped cutting. He stared into the fire. The flames danced in his dark eyes. I was a scout for the Union Pacific, he said, his voice low and rhythmic, like he was reciting a eulogy. I tracked routes. I found water. The men who died at Blackwood, they weren't miners. They were claim jumpers working for a syndicate out of Denver. They slaughtered a Chinese family to take their spot on the river. I found them. He looked at Hattie. I didn't murder them. I executed them. There is a difference. Hattie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. And Marshall Crane? Crane was on their payroll, Gideon said. He arrested me to keep me quiet. He couldn't hang me right away because I had sent a telegram to the governor about the syndicate. He was waiting for the reply to be lost so he could string me up without questions. He stood up and walked toward her. Hattie stiffened, clutching her reticule. Why did you really marry me, Hattie? Gideon asked. He was close enough that she could smell the smoke on his skin. You're a city girl. You have grit, I'll give you that. But you didn't marry a caged animal just to avoid scrubbing floors in a brothel. There are easier ways to escape. Hattie reached into her dress pocket and pulled out the letter Arthur Pym had sent her. She handed it to Gideon. Arthur Pym was my cousin, she said softly. Gideon raised an eyebrow. Cousin? You told Crane you were his fiancée. I lied. Arthur was the only family I had left. He wrote to me saying he found something. Not gold. Something else. Something that made him afraid. He said if anything happened to him, I should come and find the ledger under the loose stone. Then he stopped writing. Hattie looked around the shack. I came here to find out who killed him. When Crane told me he died in a cave-in, I knew it was a lie. Arthur was terrified of caves. He was a panner, not a digger. He would never go into a deep shaft. Gideon read the letter. His expression darkened. So, you needed a bodyguard. I needed a weapon, Hattie corrected him. And you were the biggest one available. Gideon actually laughed then. It was a rusty, unused sound, but it made him look human. Well, Mrs. Holt, you certainly have a talent for making bad decisions. He walked over to the far wall of the cabin, where the stone chimney met the wooden floor. He knelt and ran his massive hand over the hearthstones. He tapped one. It sounded hollow. With a grunt of effort, Gideon pried the stone loose. Underneath wasn't a ledger. It was a small, canvas-wrapped bundle and a heavy, strange-looking rock. Gideon unwrapped the bundle. It was a map, and inside the map was a deed. "Mother of God?" Gideon whispered. "What is it?" Hattie asked, kneeling beside him. "This isn't just a claim," Gideon said, tracing the lines on the map with a finger the size of a sausage. "This is a survey map of the entire valley. Look here." He pointed to a red line drawn right through the town of Orofino. "That's the railroad," Hattie said. "But the railroad isn't coming here. They bypassed Orofino years ago." "That's what they told everyone," Gideon said, his eyes narrowing. "So the land prices would drop. Crane and his backers have been buying up every claim in the valley for pennies on the dollar. But Arthur found the real survey. He picked up the strange, heavy rock. It was dull gray, but when the firelight hit it, it sparkled with a deep violet hue. "Silver?" Hattie asked. "Better," Gideon said. "Copper. The purest I've ever seen. With electricity coming to the cities, copper is going to be worth more than gold. This mountain is sitting on a fortune, Hattie, and Crane knows it." Gideon looked at her. "Your cousin wasn't killed for debt. He was killed because he wouldn't sell. And now, by marrying me and coming here, we have the proof," Hattie finished. "No." Gideon stood up, blowing out the lantern, plunging them into the firelight. "Now, we are the loose ends." As if on cue, a gunshot shattered the silence of the night. The oilskin window exploded inward. A bullet thwacked into the log wall, inches from Hattie's head. Hattie screamed, dropping to the floor. Gideon moved with a speed that defied his size. He flipped the heavy oak table onto its side, creating a barricade. He grabbed Hattie by the collar and hauled her behind it. "Stay down!" he roared. Another shot rang out, then another. The wood splintered around them. "They followed us," Hattie gasped, pressing her hands over her ears. "Crane didn't wait for the apple," Gideon growled. He reached into the canvas bag Hattie had brought. "Did you bring what I asked?" Hattie nodded frantically. She fumbled in the bag and pulled out the heavy Colt peacemaker she had stolen from the marshal's office during the confusion of the wedding. Gideon took the gun. He checked the cylinder. 6 shots. 6 shots against the posse, Gideon muttered. He looked at Hattie. His eyes were no longer weary. They were alive. They were the eyes of the beast of Bannock. "Hattie," he said, his voice calm amidst the gunfire shredding their shelter. "Can you shoot?" "I shot rats in the tenement basement," she stammered. "Good enough. Stay here. If anyone comes through that door who isn't me, you shoot them in the gut. Understand?" "Where are you going?" Hattie cried, grabbing his arm. Gideon looked at the back wall of the cabin, where the logs were rotted and weak. He grinned, and it was terrifying. "I'm going hunting." Gideon lowered his shoulder and charged at the back wall. With a crash of splintering timber, he smashed right through the rotten logs, tumbling out into the snow and the darkness behind the cabin. Hattie was alone behind the table. The front door groaned as someone kicked it from the outside. "Open up, Mrs. Holt." Marshal Crane's voice drifted in, mocking and cruel. "Honey, I'm home." Hattie gripped the stolen gun with both hands. She aimed it at the door. The wood splintered again. Click. She cocked the hammer. The door to the cabin didn't just open. It disintegrated. A heavy boot struck the latch, and the wood, already weakened by rot and bullets, gave way with a shriek of tearing metal. Hattie squeezed the trigger. The heavy Colt peacemaker bucked in her hands like a living thing, the recoil jarring her shoulders all the way to her teeth. The sound was deafening in the small space, louder than the thunder rolling outside. In the doorway, a silhouette crumpled. It wasn't Marshal Crane. It was one of the deputies, a man named Silas who had laughed when Hattie walked toward the cage that morning. He clutched his thigh, howling, and fell backward into the snow. "She's armed," Crane's voice screamed from the darkness outside. "Burn it! Burn the witch out!" A torch came flying through the open door, tumbling end over end, trailing sparks. It landed on the pile of dry cedar Gideon had stacked. Within seconds, the dry bark caught. Smoke began to fill the room, thick and acrid. Hattie coughed, eyes streaming. She scrambled backward, pressing herself into the corner behind the overturned table. She cocked the gun again, but her hands were shaking so violently she nearly dropped it. The fire was growing, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. The heat was becoming unbearable. "Come on out, Mrs. Holt," Crane yelled. "We can make this quick." Suddenly, the shooting stopped. From outside, behind the cabin where Gideon had smashed through the wall, there was a sound. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a wet, sickening crunch, then a gurgle, then silence. "Miller?" Crane called out. "Miller, report." No answer. Just the wind howling through the pines. "Boys, flank the back," Crane ordered, his voice pitching higher. Hattie watched the open doorway. She saw a shadow move, not across the door, but above it. Gideon Holt had not run away. He had climbed the roof. With a roar that sounded like a grizzly bear, Gideon launched himself from the eaves of the burning cabin. He landed directly on top of the two men preparing to rush the door. The impact drove them into the mud with bone-shattering force. Gideon didn't have a gun. He had a skinning knife in one hand and a hatchet he'd pulled from the woodpile in the other. The scene that followed was a blur of violence illuminated by the burning cabin. Hattie watched, horrified and mesmerized, as her husband moved through the men like a scythe through wheat. He was a whirlwind of brutality. He parried a rifle butt with his forearm and drove the hatchet handle into a man's stomach. He kicked another man so hard in the knee that the leg bent backward. He wasn't killing them, Hattie realized. He was dismantling them. Marshal Crane, realizing the tide had turned, fired 2 wild shots into the melee. One sparked off the axe head. The other tore through the sleeve of Gideon's coat. "Fall back," Crane screamed, realizing his hired thugs were no match for the legend of the beast. "Regroup at the ridge." Crane scrambled onto his horse and galloped into the dark, leaving 3 of his men groaning in the snow. Gideon stood panting in the flickering light of the fire. Blood dripped from his left hand. Not his, Hattie hoped. He turned toward the cabin. The fire had consumed the far wall. The roof was groaning. "Hattie!" he bellowed. "Get out! Now!" Hattie grabbed the canvas bag containing the map and the copper ore. She crawled over the table and ran out into the freezing night. She collided with Gideon's chest. He felt like a stone wall. He grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. "Are you hit?" he demanded, scanning her frantically. "No," she gasped, the cold air burning her smoke-filled lungs. "You?" "Nothing that matters," he grunted. He looked at the burning cabin. "We lost the shelter, and this fire is a beacon. Every mercenary within 50 miles will see it and come running for Crane's bounty." "Where do we go?" Hattie asked, looking at the wall of white snow falling around them. "We can't survive in the open. It's 10 degrees below zero." Gideon looked toward the dark, gaping maw of the ravine. Then he looked up the mountain, toward the jagged peaks obscured by the storm. "We don't go up," Gideon said, wiping the blood from his face. "And we don't go down. We go in." In the Blackwood Mine, Gideon said. The entrance is 1/2 mile east. It cuts through the mountain and comes out near the ghost town of Garnet. It's the only way to bypass Crane's men. But the mine, Hattie hesitated. Marshal Crane said it's unstable. That's how Arthur died. Gideon looked at her, his eyes grim. The mine is dangerous, Hattie. But out here, we're already dead. Crane will have 30 men here by dawn, with long-range rifles. The mountain will hide us. He took the heavy bag from her. Stay in my footprints. If you fall, you get up. If you can't get up, you crawl. Do you understand? Hattie looked at the burning ruin of her cousin's home. She looked at the unconscious men in the snow. Then she looked at the monster she had married. Lead the way, husband, she said. The entrance to the Blackwood Mine looked like the mouth of hell. It was a jagged tear in the rock face, framed by rotting timbers that smelled of wet decay. The wind whistled as it passed the opening, creating a low, mournful moan that sounded like a human voice. Gideon pried the boards off the entrance with his hatchet. He lit a kerosene lantern he had salvaged from the supplies in the bag. The yellow light barely penetrated the gloom. Stay close, he whispered. The air can be bad in pockets. If the flame turns blue, we run back. If the flame goes out, we pray. They stepped inside. The silence was instant and oppressive. The storm outside was silenced, replaced by the drip, drip, drip of water and the crunch of their boots on loose shale. They walked for an hour without speaking. The tunnel was narrow, shored up by beams that bowed under the weight of the mountain. Hattie felt the crushing weight of the rock above her. It was terrifying, yet strangely intimate. In the dark, stripped of the world, there was only the two of them. Gideon stopped suddenly. He leaned against the rock wall, his breathing ragged. Hattie moved the lantern closer. Gideon? He slid down the wall to a sitting position. Just a moment. Hattie saw the blood then. It was soaking through the thick wool of his coat, just above his hip. Crane's wild shot hadn't missed after all. You're shot, Hattie said, panic rising in her throat. Through and through, Gideon gritted out. Missed the bone, but it's bleeding like a stuck pig. We have to stop, Hattie said. She set the lantern on a rock. I have to bind it. We can't stop, Gideon argued, though his voice was weaker. Crane knows these mines too. He'll send trackers. You will bleed to death before we reach Garnet, Hattie snapped, her fear turning into anger. And I didn't go to the trouble of marrying you just to become a widow on the first night. Take off your coat. Gideon stared at her. The lantern light cast deep shadows on his face. He saw the stubborn set of her jaw, the same look she had when she faced the marshal. Slowly, he nodded. He peeled off the heavy coat and the blood-soaked shirt beneath. His torso was a map of violence. Old scars from knives, bullets, and whips crisscrossed his skin. But the fresh wound on his side was pulsing red. Hattie didn't flinch. She tore strips from her petticoat, the white cotton stark against the dirt of the mine. She used the whiskey from the flask in the bag to clean the wound. Gideon hissed through his teeth, his hand gripping a rock until his knuckles turned white, but he didn't cry out. Talk to me, Hattie said, her hands working quickly to pack the wound. Distract yourself. Tell me about the cage. Gideon looked at her, sweat beading on his forehead. The cage? You were in it for 3 months. How did you not go mad? Gideon closed his eyes. I did. For a while. I screamed until my throat bled. I rattled the bars until my hands broke. But then I went quiet. Why? Because I realized that Crane wanted me to scream, Gideon whispered. He wanted the town to see a beast. As long as I roared, I was exactly what he said I was. So I stopped. I sat. I waited. I built a house in my mind. He opened his eyes and looked at Hattie. I imagined a place with no bars, a place with a fire, and a woman who wasn't afraid. Hattie's hands stilled for a moment. She finished tying the knot on the bandage. Did the woman look like me? Gideon reached out. His hand, rough and massive, cupped her cheek. His thumb brushed away a smudge of coal dust. No, he said softly. You're much tougher than the woman I imagined. For a moment, the darkness of the mind didn't matter. There was a charge between them, a connection forged in blood and survival. Hattie leaned into his touch, her heart hammering. Then a sound echoed down the tunnel. Scrape, scrape, splash, footsteps coming from behind them. Gideon's eyes snapped open, the tenderness vanishing instantly, replaced by the predator's glare. He grabbed his shirt and coat, wincing as he pulled them on. They're inside, he whispered. 2 men, maybe 3, trying to move quiet. How do you know? I can smell their torch smoke, Gideon said. He stood up, swaying slightly before steadying himself. We have to move. There's a junction up ahead. We can lose them in the drift tunnels. They extinguished the lantern. Gideon took Hattie's hand, and they moved into the pitch black. Gideon navigated by touch and memory, counting his steps. Hattie followed, blindly trusting the man who held her hand. They turned left into a narrower shaft. The air here was colder, smelling of something sweet and rotten. Wait, Gideon whispered. He stopped so abruptly, Hattie bumped into him. He struck a match, shielding the flame with his body. The light flared, revealing a cavernous chamber. It wasn't a mining drift. It was a natural cave that the miners had broken into, and the floor was covered in bones. Hattie stifled a scream, pressing her hand over her mouth. There were dozens of them, human skeletons still clad in the rotting rags of miners' clothes. Some had pickaxes lying next to them. The Chinese workers, Gideon said, his voice hollow. The family from the river. And others. This is where Crane put them. He stepped forward, holding the match lower. He kicked something near the wall. It was a distinct plaid coat, a coat Hattie recognized instantly. Arthur, she whispered. She fell to her knees beside the skeleton. The skull had been crushed from behind. The letter in her pocket felt heavy. He found this, Gideon said, piecing it together. He didn't just find the copper survey. He found the graveyard. He found where Crane hid the bodies of the men who wouldn't sell. This is why, Hattie wept, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on her face. This is why he killed him. It wasn't debt. It was this. We have the deed, Gideon said, his voice hard as iron. And now we have the bodies. If we get out of here, Hattie Crane hangs. Not me. Crane. The sound of footsteps grew louder. They were close now. The flicker of torchlight danced on the tunnel wall behind them. There's no exit this way, Hattie realized, looking at the dead end of the cave. We're trapped. Gideon blew out the match. He pulled Hattie behind a large pile of rocks near the entrance of the bone chamber. He pressed the Colt peacemaker into her hand. I have 4 bullets left, she whispered, her voice trembling. Keep them, Gideon said. He pulled the hatchet from his belt. He stood in the darkness, blending into the shadows like a wraith. When they come in, Gideon whispered in her ear, they will look at the bones. They will be scared. Fear makes men slow. Gideon, Hattie grabbed his wrist. You're hurt. You can't fight them all. I don't have to fight them, Hattie, Gideon said, and she could hear the grim smile in his voice. I just have to introduce them to the dark. The torchlight spilled into the chamber. 2 shadows stretched long across the floor of bones. Sweet Mother of God, a man's voice trembled. Look at this. Forget the bones, a second voice hissed. Find the girl. Crane wants the head. They stepped into the room. From the ceiling above them, where he had silently climbed into the support beams, despite his bleeding side, Gideon dropped. The darkness of the bone chamber exploded into violence. Gideon didn't land like a man. He landed like a collapsing roof beam. He struck the first tracker, a man named Elias, driving him into the floor with a sickening crunch of cartilage. The torch flew from Elias's hand, skittering across the floor and landing amongst the dry, brittle ribs of the skeletons. The second man, a hired gun from Denver named Pike, panicked. He swung his rifle toward the mass of shadows wrestling on the floor, but he couldn't get a clear shot. Shoot him, Pike screamed, his voice cracking. Don't shoot, Elias gurgled, pinned under Gideon's massive weight. Gideon ignored the pain in his side. The adrenaline was a drug, hot and sharp. He headbutted Elias, knocking him cold, and rose from the pile of bones like a demon rising from the grave. He was covered in dust, blood, and the grim remains of the dead. Pike leveled his rifle. Bang! The shot didn't come from Pike. It came from the shadows behind the rock pile. Pike spun around, clutching his shoulder, his rifle clattering to the stone floor. Hattie stood there, the heavy Colt Peacemaker smoking in her trembling hands. She hadn't closed her eyes. She hadn't looked away. Gideon didn't waste the moment. He lunged forward, tackling Pike, slamming him against the cave wall. He stripped the man of his weapons with practiced efficiency and shoved him down next to his unconscious partner. Check the tunnel, Gideon barked, his chest heaving. Hattie ran to the entrance. Clear, but I hear horses. More men coming down the main drift. Gideon looked at the torch flickering among the bones. The dry clothes of the skeletons were beginning to smolder. The air was already thick with the smell of burning cloth and ancient dust. We can't go back the way we came, Gideon said. He looked up at the ceiling, at a narrow fissure where fresh air was drafting in. The same fissure he had climbed down from. We have to go up. Up? Hattie looked at the vertical shaft. Gideon, you're bleeding through the bandage. Then climb fast, wife, Gideon growled, because this mountain is about to become a furnace. He boosted her up. Hattie found footholds in the rough rock, hauling herself up into the narrow ventilation chimney. It was tight, claustrophobic, and terrified her more than the men with guns. She reached down, grabbing Gideon's good arm. He was heavy, dead weight. He grunted with every pull, his boots scraping against the stone. Blood left a slick trail on the rock wall, but he didn't stop. They scrambled out of the ventilation shaft and into the gray, freezing light of dawn. They were on the far side of the ridge, overlooking the ghost town of Garnet. Gideon collapsed into the snow. Hattie fell beside him. She ripped open his coat. The bandage was soaked through. His skin was gray, clammy to the touch. We made it, Hattie whispered, pressing her hands against the wound to staunch the flow. Not yet, Gideon rasped. He pointed down the slope toward the road that led back to Orofino. There, riding hard toward the mine entrance, was Marshal Crane and a posse of 12 men. They hadn't seen Hattie and Gideon emerge from the vent. They were heading into the mine to finish the job. "They'll find the bodies," Hattie said. "They'll find the trackers we left alive." "And then they'll hunt us down," Gideon said. He struggled to sit up. "We can't run, Hattie. I can't make it to the state line. I can barely stand." Hattie looked at him. She looked at the man who had shielded her from bullets, who had married her to save her from a brothel, who had walked through hell for her. She looked at the bag containing the map and the chunk of copper ore. "We don't run," Hattie said, her voice hardening into something new, something unbreakable. "We go back." Gideon looked at her, confused. "Back?" "To Orofino," Hattie said. "The men are all here, hunting us. The town is empty of Crane's thugs. We go back. We break into the telegraph office. And we send the message Arthur Pym died trying to send." "It's suicide," Gideon said, though a flicker of admiration lit his eyes. "It's the only play we have," Hattie countered. She stood up and offered him her hand. "You said you wanted to kill the men who put you in the cage. Let's go kill their career first." They stole 2 horses from the terrified supply clerk at the Garnet mining outpost. They rode hard, back toward the town that had condemned them. They arrived in Orofino at high noon. The storm had broken. The sun was blindingly bright, reflecting off the snow and the mud. They didn't sneak in. They rode right down Main Street. Hattie looked like a specter. Her wedding dress was torn, stained with mud, soot, and blood. Her hair was wild, blowing in the wind. Gideon rode beside her, slumped in the saddle, looking like a dying king. The townspeople stopped. The miners, the shopkeepers, the women washing clothes. They all froze. They had heard the gunfire in the night. They had seen the smoke. They expected to see bodies brought back on a cart. Instead, they saw the bride and the beast returning from the grave. They stopped in front of the telegraph office. Hattie slid from her horse. She helped Gideon down. He leaned heavily on her, his breathing wet and ragged. "Get the operator," Gideon ordered a passing boy. The boy ran. Hattie kicked open the door to the telegraph office. The clerk, a timid man named Mr. Abernathy, looked up and dropped his coffee cup. "Mrs. Holt," he stammered. "The marshal said you were dead. He said you were killed by Indians." "The marshal lied," Hattie said loudly, ensuring the gathering crowd outside could hear. She slapped the survey map and the heavy chunk of copper ore onto the counter. "Send a wire to the governor in Helena, and send one to the Union Pacific Railroad office in Salt Lake." "I can't," Abernathy said, glancing at the door. "Marshal Crane reviews all outgoing messages." Gideon stepped forward. He looked huge, bloody, and terrifying. He placed his hand on the counter. "Review this, Abernathy." He pulled his coat aside to reveal the Colt Peacemaker. "Send the wire," Gideon rumbled. "Tell them Orofino sits on the largest copper deposit in the territory. Tell them Marshal Crane has been murdering claimants to steal the land, and tell them Gideon Holt is holding the evidence." Abernathy began to type. Click, clack, click, clack. The sound was louder than a gunshot. Outside, the crowd grew. They whispered. They pointed at the ore on the counter. They knew what copper meant. It meant jobs. It meant real money, not just the scraps Crane allowed them to have. "You think this saves you?" The voice cut through the crowd. Marshal Crane had returned. He sat on his black horse at the end of the street, his posse fanning out behind him. He had seen the tracks leading back to town. "Step away from the telegraph, Hattie," Crane shouted, drawing his revolver, "and surrender the prisoner." Hattie walked out onto the boardwalk. She stood in front of Gideon, shielding him. "He is not a prisoner," Hattie yelled, her voice ringing off the storefronts. "He is my husband, and he is a free man under the law." "He is a killer," Crane roared. "He killed Arthur Pym. He killed my deputies last night." "Liar," Hattie screamed. She reached into her reticule and pulled out the object she had taken from the bone cave. She held it up high. It was a pocket watch. The gold casing was dented, but the inscription was clear. "This was Arthur Pym's watch," Hattie shouted. "I found it in the Blackwood mine. In a cave filled with the bones of the men you murdered, Marshal. The Chinese family, the prospectors from Glorious Creek. You killed them all to hide the copper," the crowd murmured. The miners looked at Crane. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. "She's hysterical," Crane sneered, though his eyes darted nervously to the angry faces of the townsfolk. "Boys, cut them down." Crane's men raised their rifles. "No!" It wasn't Gideon who shouted. It was the blacksmith, a burly man named Miller. He stepped out of the crowd, holding a heavy hammer. "I recognize that watch," Miller said, pointing at Hattie's hand. "Arthur showed it to me the week he died. Said he was scared of you, Crane." "Stand down, Miller," Crane warned. "You stand down," another voice said. The owner of the general store stepped out, holding a shotgun. Then another. Then another. The people of Orofino had lived in fear of the beast in the cage for months. But looking at the bloodied, broken man leaning against the doorframe, and the fierce, brave woman standing in front of him, they realized they had been afraid of the wrong monster. Crane looked around. He saw the tide turning. He saw the telegraph wire humming above his head, carrying the truth to the capital. He saw the end of his empire. His face twisted into a mask of hate. He raised his gun, aiming not at Gideon, but at Hattie. "If I go down," Crane snarled, "I take the witch with me." Bang! The shot rang out instantly. Hattie didn't fall. Marshal Crane looked down at his chest. A dark red bloom was spreading across his shirt. He looked up, eyes wide with shock. Gideon Holt stood on the boardwalk. He had pushed Hattie aside. His hand was steady. The Colt Peacemaker was smoking. It was a shot made by a marksman, a shot made by a legend. Crane tumbled from his horse, landing face down in the mud he had ruled for so long. Silence descended on the street. Gideon looked at the crowd. He looked at the smoking gun in his hand. Then he looked at Hattie. His eyes rolled back, and the mountain finally fell. The Copper King, April 1884. The snow had melted, revealing the green shoots of spring in the valley. The town of Orofino was unrecognizable. The sounds of construction hammered through the air. The railroad spur was already halfway completed. Hattie stood on the porch of the new house. It had glass windows, real ones, shipped from St. Louis. She watched the man chopping wood in the yard. He moved a little slower now, favoring his left side, but he was still strong. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and looked up at her. The beard was trimmed. The wild mane was cut. But the eyes were the same, dark, intense, and now filled with peace. Gideon Holt walked up the steps. He took his wife's hand. "The lawyers are here," he said softly, "from the mining company." "Let them wait," Hattie said, squeezing his fingers. "They want to know what we're naming the mine," Gideon said. "They suggested the Holt Copper Works." Hattie smiled. She looked out, over the valley, past the town, toward the dark mouth of the Blackwood mine where they had almost died. "No," she said. "Call it the Arthur Pym. It's his claim." Gideon nodded. He kissed her knuckles. As you say, Mrs. Holt. And Gideon? Yes? The cage, she said. The iron cage in the square. The town council wants to know what to do with it. Gideon looked toward the town. He thought about the cold, the hunger, the jeers. He thought about the woman who had walked up to the bars and offered him a life. Melt it down, Gideon said. Tell them to make it into a bell for the new church. Let it ring. He put his arm around Hattie, and together they walked inside their home, closing the door against the wind. They say truth is stranger than fiction, and in the case of Hattie Corcoran and Gideon Holt, it was stronger than steel. The Beast of Bannock went on to become one of the wealthiest men in Montana, known not for his violence, but for his fair wages and the massive library he built for the miners' children. He and Hattie remained married for 43 years, until Gideon passed away in his sleep in 1926. It's a reminder that sometimes the monsters aren't the ones behind bars. They're the ones holding the keys. And sometimes salvation doesn't come from a prayer, but from a desperate woman with a law book and the courage to ask a terrifying question. What do you think? Would you have had the courage to unlock that cage? Or would you have let the beast sleep? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of survival, romance, and justice in the Wild West, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story from the frontier. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next trail.